I still remember the sound that woke me up that morning. It wasn't roosters or the soft hum of the wind through my wheat fields. No, it was the roar of engines and the harsh metallic clank of a chain-link fence being torn down. By the time I got to my front porch, barefoot and still in my old flannel, I froze. The entire HOA board, led by Karen herself, was on my land, trucks lined up, tractors pushing through my crops like they were clearing trash. My barn door was hanging open, and men I'd never seen before were carrying out crates of produce, sacks of grain, and even my livestock. Karen stood in the middle of it all, sunglasses perched on her head, a clipboard in hand like she was running a military operation. When she saw me, she smirked, not a friendly smile, but one of those smug, cold ones that says, "You can't stop me." She yelled over the noise, "We warned you about this, and now the HOA is taking what we're owed." They weren't owed anything. Not 1 cent. But they didn't care. They took the chickens I raised since they were hatchlings, my last 2 dairy cows, even the beehives that my late wife had tended with so much love. By the time I thought to grab my phone for evidence, one of the men shoved me back with a, "Stay out of the way, old man, or we'll make it worse." I wanted to shout, to fight, to call the sheriff right then and there, but I knew one wrong move and they'd have me in handcuffs instead. The sound of my barn door slamming shut for the last time that morning will haunt me forever. And right as I stood there, powerless, Karen leaned in close enough for me to smell her perfume and whispered, "By the time you're done crying, it'll all be gone." But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this wasn't going to end the way they thought. They had just set in motion something they'd regret for the rest of their lives. It all started months before the loot happened, back when life was still simple. When my farm was more than just dirt and wood. It was my sanctuary. Back then, I lived in a small farmhouse tucked away at the edge of the county line, a place I'd inherited from my father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of work were in that land. Every fence post had been placed with our own hands, every field plowed by our own sweat. The HOA didn't even exist when I moved here. The neighborhood they managed was 2 miles away, shiny new houses with perfect lawns and driveways wide enough for 3 SUVs. But as the area grew, so did their reach, and before long, they started sniffing around, claiming they had jurisdiction over properties outside their original neighborhood. At first, it was harmless, letters in the mail about community beautification and noise ordinances. I tossed them in the trash. I wasn't in their community, and I had no interest in joining. But then came the day Karen herself showed up at my front gate. She was the kind of person who spoke in a way that made you feel like she was doing you a favor, even when she was threatening you. She told me the HOA was expanding and that it would be easier for everyone if I just joined now, so I wouldn't be fined later. I laughed in her face. That was my first mistake. From then on, the letters turned into warnings, the warnings into fines, and the fines into threats of property seizure. I thought it was all bluff and paper-pushing nonsense, until one morning I found tire tracks in my wheat field. A week later, I noticed one of my irrigation lines had been cut. I fixed it myself, but it set me back days. I kept telling myself it couldn't be them, surely no one would go that far just to push someone into their HOA. But I underestimated Karen's determination. Despite it all, I kept living the way I always had. I sold fresh produce at the farmer's market, donated eggs and milk to the local food bank, and even let the neighborhood kids visit during lambing season to feed the baby sheep. I wasn't rich, but I was proud. My farm wasn't just my livelihood, it was my way of giving back. That spring, I hosted a community picnic, like I did every year. Neighbors from miles around brought pies, casseroles, and laughter. Even some families from Karen's HOA showed up, and for a while, I thought maybe things were cooling down. Kids ran through the fields, couples danced to a local bluegrass band, and for a brief moment, life felt untouched by all the trouble. But as the sun set, I noticed Karen standing off to the side, not smiling, not talking, just watching. It was the kind of look you give when you're measuring someone up, deciding exactly how to break them. And sure enough, the next week, everything started spiraling. First, the HOA filed a public nuisance complaint against my farm animals. Then they claimed my property was out of compliance with their community rules that didn't even apply to me. When I ignored them, they sent people to inspect my land without permission. I chased them off, but I knew they'd be back. And they did come back. Not to inspect, but to take. It was a Tuesday morning when I heard the trucks. I ran out thinking maybe it was a delivery or a neighbor in trouble, but no. This was it. The day they made good on every threat they'd whispered and written. Engines roared, my land shook under the weight of machinery, and the air filled with the smell of diesel and dust. My barn was emptied, my animals loaded up, and my crops torn apart. People I'd never seen before stormed through my farm like they were raiding an enemy camp. I tried to push past the men blocking my way, but every time I moved forward, another pair of hands shoved me back. Karen stayed just out of reach, smirking as she checked off items on her clipboard like she was grocery shopping. And then, right when I thought I couldn't watch another second, one of the men yanked open my tool shed, stepped inside, and froze. His eyes went wide. Karen? You might want to see this. The way her face changed told me everything. Something in that shed just turned the tables, and she didn't even know how bad it was going to get for her. Karen strutted toward the shed like she owned the place, her clipboard tucked under her arm, but I could see the tightness in her jaw. She tried to keep her voice steady when she told the man to step aside, but her hands twitched as she grabbed the doorframe and peered in. Inside that shed wasn't just my farming tools and old work gloves. No, what sat on the far shelf, locked in a steel case with thick chains, was something I'd kept hidden for years. Something she had no business touching. It was a set of legal files. Thick, weathered binders and notarized deeds, proof of ownership not just for my farm, but for a huge chunk of land surrounding it. And here's the kicker, a lot of that land was where their precious HOA neighborhood sat. I'd inherited the mineral rights and the underlying property rights decades ago from a distant uncle nobody in the family even knew had been a land baron in his day. The residents owned their houses, sure, but the dirt beneath? That was mine. The man looked confused, but Karen didn't. She knew enough to understand what she was staring at. Her smirk faltered for just a second, and she muttered something under her breath I couldn't quite catch. Then she snapped back into her ice-cold mask and told her crew to keep going like nothing had happened. I wanted to laugh right then. She thought she was taking my livelihood? She had no idea she'd just handed me the rope I'd use to pull her entire operation into court. But in that moment, I didn't move. I let them finish their loot, because the more they took, the bigger the number on the lawsuit was going to be. My stomach churned as I watched my goats shoved into a trailer, the feed barrels tipped over, and my beehives stacked like trophies in the back of their pickup trucks. By the time they left, my farm looked like a ghost town. The once green fields were scarred with deep tire tracks, my barn echoed with emptiness, and the air felt wrong. Quiet, but not peaceful. More like the kind of silence after a storm when you know the real damage hasn't even revealed itself yet. I sat on my porch with my head in my hands, my dog Scout resting at my feet, when I heard a soft knock. It was Linda, a neighbor who lived just past the creek. She's the kind of woman who always brings fresh pie when someone's sick and shows up with jumper cables when your truck dies in the cold. She'd been at the picnic the month before and had seen the way Karen was watching me. I heard the trucks, she said quietly, setting a thermos of coffee on the table. I couldn't stop them, but I got pictures. She pulled out her phone and showed me photo after photo, Karen directing her crew, the men hauling my property, the trailers heading toward the HOA's community center. There it was, clear as day, proof of everything they'd done. My chest tightened with gratitude. For the next couple of days, the farm stayed eerily empty. I still had the deed files hidden away, and I spent every night poring over them, calling an old friend of mine, Jameson, a retired attorney who owed me a favor from way back when I'd helped save his father's orchard. He listened quietly, then told me something that made my heart pound. "They've just committed multiple felonies," he said. "Not just trespass, grand theft, destruction of property, livestock theft, and possibly racketeering if we can prove it's an organized effort by the HOA. You've got them, and you've got them big." It was the first time in days I felt hope. But the relief didn't last long. On the third day, a letter appeared in my mailbox, no stamp, no postmark, just folded paper with the HOA letterhead. I unfolded it and felt my blood boil. It read, "Per our enforcement action, your property is now subject to ongoing inspection. Any interference will result in legal escalation. Consider this your final warning." That wasn't just arrogance, that was them doubling down. And I knew exactly what legal escalation meant in Karen's language: more trucks, more men, more destruction. That night, as the moon lit up my torn-up fields, I sat on my porch with Scout at my side and a shotgun leaning against the railing, not to start trouble, but to make sure no one tried anything before I was ready to hit them where it hurt most, in court. And then, just before midnight, I saw the faint glow of headlights creeping down my driveway. Not trucks this time, but a single black SUV I recognized instantly. It was Karen. And she wasn't alone. The SUV rolled to a slow stop about 20 feet from my porch, its headlights washing over me and Scout. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then the driver's door opened, and Karen stepped out, her heels clicking against the gravel like she was walking into a boardroom instead of trespassing on my land in the dead of night. Two men got out behind her, big, broad-shouldered types who looked like they were more used to persuading people than talking to them. They stayed near the vehicle, their eyes scanning the property, but I could feel they were ready to step in if Karen gave the word. She didn't say hello. Didn't even pretend to be cordial. She just looked me straight in the eye and said, "I hear you've been making calls. To lawyers. To neighbors. That's a mistake." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice calm even though my grip on the shotgun tightened. "Funny, I was thinking it was the smartest thing I've done all week." Her lips curled into that smug half-smile again, the same one she'd worn when they looted my barn. "We can make this easy, John. Sign over certain rights, mineral, water, whatever else you think you've got tucked away in those little papers of yours, and this whole mess goes away. You keep your land, and I'll make sure you get some of your animals back. Refuse, and we'll see how much damage the next inspection does." I didn't answer right away. The quiet stretched between us, broken only by Scout's low growl and the faint hum of the SUV's engine. Finally, I stood up, slow and deliberate, the porch creaking under my boots. "Karen," I said evenly, "you already crossed a line you can't uncross. And you just made another mistake showing up here tonight." Her eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," I replied. For the first time since I'd met her, I saw her confidence waver. Just a flicker, but it was there. She muttered something to the men, then turned on her heel and got back in the SUV. The headlights swept over me again as they turned around and rolled back down the driveway, disappearing into the night. The moment they were gone, I pulled out my phone and called Jameson. "They just showed up," I told him. "Middle of the night. I've got witnesses, I've got photos, and I've got every legal reason to burn them to the ground in court." "Good," he said. "Then we move faster. I'll file the injunction in the morning." The next day was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet you don't trust. I worked in the garden, patched up a section of fence, and tried to focus on normal farm chores. Neighbors stopped by to drop off casseroles, coffee, and words of encouragement. Linda came with fresh eggs from her own hens, promising she'd testify to everything she'd seen. The community, Even folks who didn't know me that well were starting to rally. And just as I began to think maybe we'd have a few days to prepare our case in peace, the sound hit me. It was the grinding roar of heavy machinery, louder than before, angrier somehow. I ran to the porch, my chest tightening. Coming down the road wasn't just a couple of trucks this time. It was a full convoy. Flatbeds, loaders, even a backhoe. And in the lead, standing tall in the passenger seat of the first vehicle like a conquering queen, was Karen. They weren't here to loot. This time, they were here to tear something down. The convoy rumbled onto my land like an invading army, dust clouds rising behind them. Karen hopped down from the lead truck, her arms crossed and sunglasses perched on her head, even though the morning sun had barely cleared the tree line. Her voice carried over the engines as she barked orders to the men. Start with the outer fences. Rip them out, all of them. Then clear that shed and the old grain silo. We're making this property compliant, today. The men didn't waste a second. One crew hooked chains to my cedar fence posts and yanked them out of the ground like they were pulling weeds. Another headed straight for the grain silo, crowbars and sledgehammers in hand. The clang of metal rang out across the field as my stomach twisted into knots. I stepped off the porch and planted myself in the middle of the driveway. You step one more foot toward that shed, I shouted, and you'll be explaining to a judge why you ignored a court order. Karen laughed, sharp and dismissive. What court order? Last I checked, you're just an old man playing farmer. She didn't know. Jameson had filed the emergency injunction at sunrise, and though it would take a day or so to serve it officially, the clock was ticking against her. I kept my voice steady, but I made sure she heard the confidence behind it. You'll find out soon enough. That made her pause. Just for a second, her eyes darted toward the shed, like she was wondering if she was walking into something she didn't see coming. But then the arrogance returned, and she waved her hand for the men to keep going. Linda and two other neighbors appeared at the property line, phones out, recording everything. The crew didn't like that, they shifted uncomfortably, glancing between their work and the cameras. One of them muttered, "Karen, maybe we should." "Keep working," she snapped. "We're on legal ground." Legal ground? She couldn't have been more wrong. I didn't try to stop them physically. Every splintered fence post, every dented piece of my silo, every crushed row of vegetables, it all added to the damages we were stacking against the HOA. And while the destruction burned me up inside, I kept telling myself this was the kind of evidence lawyers dream about. But just as I started to retreat back toward the porch, I noticed two men breaking off from the main group. They weren't tearing down fences. They were heading straight toward my barn, the same barn they'd cleaned out days earlier. Something about their pace set off alarms in my head. I hurried to intercept them, calling out, "Hey! What do you think you're doing?" Neither answered. One pulled open the barn door while the other stepped inside. Seconds later, a sharp, panicked voice echoed from within. "Karen! We've got a problem." Karen's head snapped toward the barn, and for the first time, I saw her face pale. She dropped her clipboard and started running. Karen's heels crunched across the gravel as she bolted toward the barn, her two muscle-bound sidekicks right behind her. The rest of the crew stopped what they were doing, their engines idling, the clang of tools falling silent. Everyone's eyes followed her. I walked faster, closing the distance, but I didn't rush. Part of me wanted her to get a real good look before I reminded her exactly what she was dealing with. Inside the barn, the men were standing stiff, their flashlights pointed at the far corner. That's where I'd moved some of my late father's old crates, heavy, padlocked chests that hadn't been opened in years. On top of them sat a stack of manila folders and a rolled-up set of blueprints. "Tell me you didn't touch those," I said, stepping into the doorway. One of the men glanced at Karen, waiting for her to speak. She didn't. She was staring at the top folder, the one with the county seal and the bold red stamp across the front, property and mineral rights, confidential. This is yours?" she asked, her voice shaky now. "It's been mine for 50 years, I said. Every acre under your HOA. Every waterway. Every access road. You built your little empire on top of my family's land without knowing who held the rights. And you just trespassed again, making my case stronger." She swallowed hard, but then I saw that flash of defiance return to her eyes. "Rights or no rights, you can't fight the HOA forever. We've got resources. Lawyers. We'll bury you in court." That's when I smiled. "You just don't get it, do you? I'm not the one who's about to be buried." Jameson had told me earlier that morning that the county judge had already signed off on the injunction and an emergency hearing was set for Friday. And now, thanks to Karen's stunt today, she'd given me all the ammo I could ever need, video, witnesses, and proof she'd been informed of the legal dispute and still pushed ahead. Karen turned to leave, barking for her crew to pack it up, but the damage was done. My neighbors had caught every second on camera. By the time she climbed back into the SUV, I could see her mask slipping, just a hint of worry breaking through that polished smugness. The convoy started pulling out, but halfway down my driveway, one of the trucks lurched to a stop. The driver jumped out, shouting at Karen through her open window. I couldn't hear the first part, but then his voice rose, panic cutting through the engine noise. "Karen, the sheriff's here." The low rumble of a county sheriff's cruiser rolled in from the road, lights flashing red and blue across my torn-up fields. 2 deputies stepped out, hands resting casually on their belts, but their eyes sharp as hawks. The taller one, Deputy Lawson, scanned the scene, the ripped fences, the wrecked silo, the convoy of trucks halfway down my drive, and let out a slow whistle. "Morning, John," he said, nodding to me before turning his gaze on Karen. "Ma'am, you want to explain what in God's name is going on here?" Karen straightened in her seat, all fake confidence again. "This is an HOA enforcement action. Perfectly legal. This man is in violation of multiple." Lawson cut her off with a raised hand. "That's funny, because I've got a court order in my hand that says otherwise." He held up a folded paper, the official seal catching the sunlight. "Emergency injunction. Signed this morning by Judge Ellison. Prohibits the HOA, its board, and any hired contractors from setting foot on Mr. Miller's property until further notice." You could have heard a pin drop. Even the engine seemed quieter. Karen's face drained of color, but she tried to speak anyway. "I wasn't served." "You were notified," Lawson said flatly. "We've got a sworn affidavit from your office acknowledging receipt." The second deputy stepped forward. "Ma'am, we've also got multiple witness statements, time-stamped video footage, and about a dozen counts of property damage and theft to sort through. You're all coming with us." Karen's eyes darted from the deputies to her crew, looking for an escape, but Lawson was already opening her door. "Step out of the vehicle." When she hesitated, he added, "Now." The rest happened fast. The crew was separated, some muttering about just doing what they were told, others glaring at Karen like she'd just thrown them under the bus. Handcuffs clicked shut one after another. A couple of the bigger guys tried to puff up their chests, but the deputies weren't having it. Karen was the last to be cuffed. As Lawson led her past me, she tried one last jab. "You think this is over? The HOA will crush you." I leaned in just enough for her to hear. "You don't understand, Karen. By the time I'm done, there won't be an HOA left to crush anyone." The sheriff's cruisers and impounded trucks rolled out one by one, leaving behind churned dirt, broken boards, and the sweet, quiet hum of my land without their engines. 2 days later, court was in session. Jameson stood beside me, the evidence stacked high on the plaintiff's table, photos, videos, witness affidavits, property deeds, mineral rights contracts. The room was packed, neighbors filling the benches, local reporters scribbling notes. Karen sat at the defense table, looking like she'd aged 10 years in 48 hours. Her so-called high-powered lawyer kept shuffling papers like he was trying to find a miracle hiding between them. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I just told the truth. About the threats. The destruction. The theft. And most importantly, about the deed in my possession proving that beneath their glossy houses and manicured lawns, the land, and the power, was mine. By the time Jameson was done dismantling every false claim they'd made, the judge didn't just rule in my favor. He handed down a verdict that made the whole courtroom gasp. Full restitution for every dollar's worth of damage. Return of all stolen property, or payment for its value. Criminal charges for trespass, theft, and destruction of agricultural land. And a final order that the HOA was barred from any action, against me or any property owner, without explicit county approval. The board was finished. Karen was finished. And for the first time in months, I walked out of that courthouse knowing the fight was over. Back home, the sun was setting over my battered but still standing farm. Neighbors had already started helping me repair the fences, the silo, even building new coops for the chickens that would be coming back. As I stood there, Scout at my side, I thought about what my father always used to say. Kindness is strength, but strength means nothing if you don't stand up when it counts. Karen had tried to strip me of everything, but in the end, she'd only strengthened the roots I'd planted decades ago. Roots that ran deeper than her HOA could ever reach. And now, those roots were holding firm, while hers were ripped out for good.